My name is Cynthia Davidson. I am the editor and executive director of the nonprofit Anyone Corporation in New York, which is a think tank on the condition of architecture and contemporary culture. I am not an architect. I studied journalism and art history as an undergraduate and began working in newspapers before as a reporter and feature writer before I went into the nonprofit sector, working at an art museum, which led me to working at an architecture magazine in Chicago, which, time goes by quickly, which ultimately led me to a Loeb Fellowship at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and then to New York City, where I moved in the winter of 1990 and have lived since that time in New York, directing the Anyone Corporation, which I am a co-founder of. As I said, I studied journalism and art history. When I went to university, I didn't know really what I wanted to do. And I started taking art courses and taking an interior design track that was at my school, and thought quite seriously of going into architecture after 2 years of university. But I talked to students in architecture schools at other universities, and they said, "Oh, it's really hard. You won't like it." So I said, "Well, I really like writing, so I'll take up journalism." So I ended up with a double degree because of the courses, the way I had studied art and journalism. And I had always liked writing. As a child, I liked to write stories and make little newspapers for my neighbors. And so writing was something I enjoyed doing. Wasn't necessarily good at it, but I liked doing it. So when I finished university, I did a postgraduate publishing course at Radcliffe College, which is at the time was the sister of Harvard. And then went into newspapers, where I did daily reporting and then some film writing, some dance writing, some general lifestyle writing, feature-length pieces, not hard news. Then I briefly worked in public relations for a major corporation in Ohio. And then I moved to the Akron Art Museum in Ohio to do their catalogs, their exhibition catalogs, and public relations for the museum. And I know you're going to ask me about mentors. So I may as well tell you now, the director who hired me was a man named John Copelands. John Copelands was a Brit who was escaping New York for a couple of years and agreed to take this job in Ohio. But he had been one of the founding editors of Art Forum magazine in the 1960s in California. Art Forum is the leading American art museum art magazine still today. And while he was in Ohio, he said to me, "I want to start a magazine in Ohio, because Ohio is a very unusual place. Many, many universities and colleges, and many major art museums, the Cleveland Museum of Art, Toledo, Ohio Museum, Columbus Museum, Cincinnati Museum, Dayton. I mean, there are major cities, and they all have major collections in major museums." And he said, "We should have a sort of co-op magazine that brings all of these museums and all of these university art galleries together in one publication about contemporary art and contemporary exhibitions." And so he made me the managing editor of that to make it work. And I learned from John that if you have an idea, you should act on it, because it became enormously successful. Every institution participated in it in some way or another. It came out every 2 months. And when I would leave Ohio for Chicago, I guess 3 years after we started that, because John, meanwhile, went back to New York. I had the magazine skills that I could become editor of Inland Architect magazine in Chicago. Now, I had become interested in architecture while I was at the Akron Art Museum because the trustees decided to buy an old post office building across the street and turn it into a larger institution for the museum. And as the public relations person, I was sent to every meeting with the architect so that I could communicate with the public and with the press what was happening with this new project. And so I became fascinated with this whole project. And being in these meetings with this architect, was an architect named Peter Van Dyke in Cleveland, who was one of the leading architects in Cleveland. And then I got involved in saving the historic warehouse district in downtown Cleveland, which was a kind of urban design project. Because of the magazine, they wanted a little grassroots preservation newspaper in Cleveland, and they asked me to come work on that. So this idea to start this cooperative journal on contemporary architecture in Ohio led to other things for me. So when I moved to Chicago, because my husband had a new job in Chicago, I had to find a job. So I was looking around and I said, oh, here's this architecture magazine. Maybe I could do something there. And I wrote to the editor and said, I understand that you come out late and maybe I could help you. I've been doing a magazine. And he said, that would be great. I would really like to have help from someone like you, but only the publisher can hire. I can't hire, so you have to talk to him. So the publisher was an architect named Harry Weiss. Harry Weiss, the great friend of Saarinen, did a lot of work in Columbus, Indiana for the Irwin Miller and Cummins Engine, had a lot of major buildings in Chicago, was really one of the leading sort of more Scandinavian sensibility of modern architecture in Chicago. So not Miesian, not Wrightian, so not in the shadow of these two great figures in Chicago of Mies van der Rohe and Frank Lloyd Wright. And he ran this little nonprofit architecture magazine, partly because he wanted a voice. And he thought if he would have a voice to this magazine. So I met with Harry. And Harry decided I should be the editor of the magazine. He fired the editor and made me the editor. So the editor who had told me to talk to the publisher lost his job. And I turned the magazine around. The magazine was on death's door, really. It was really not coming out on time, had very few readers, had tried to be too big. And it's actually an historic title. First published in Chicago in 1883, after the Chicago fire, before the World Columbian Exposition. And I looked at these old issues in the library in Chicago and realized that all the content was written by architects, by major leading architects in Chicago in the 19th century. And I thought, well, that's just what we'll do again. We'll get architects to do the writing. I didn't know that much about architecture at that point. I mean, I have the architecture that you get in an art history course, you know, the Renaissance or Frank Lloyd Wright, but not who was building now in Chicago or any other Great Lakes state. So it was really a kind of Great Lakes magazine. And it worked. The magazine came out on time. I hired an assistant. I hired an advertising manager. We quadrupled the circulation. We got prizes for the magazine. I mean, it just came alive. And so I learned architecture on the job. And I learned it in the city of Chicago. And I learned it by going to the office every morning at 7:30 and having coffee with Harry Weiss, who was really a brilliant architect and a brilliant mind, whom I learned a lot from. And I've never looked back. I've stayed in architecture ever since that time. For me, not feeling I knew a lot about it, that having architects write for the magazine, I was learning from them what to look at, how to evaluate things, how to make judgments, when not to make a judgment. I worked with several young architects that were my age, and we hung out together, and I learned a lot from them. But there would also be times when I felt, as a journalist, there were certain things that needed to be reported or commented on in Inland Architect magazine. So I would write things occasionally for the magazine itself, but really from a journalistic point of view. And I don't think I've ever lost that point of view, because that's how I was trained. And I think it's a really useful point of view. I teach writing now in architecture schools, and I teach them that journalistic point of view because it involves a certain clarity that architects themselves need to learn how to do, that they don't have to try to be philosophers. They're not equipped to be philosophers, not usually. And they're not historians, and they're not necessarily theorists, but they have to communicate. So that was my way into actually writing about architecture. And then I had the Loeb Fellowship at Harvard in 1988, 1989 academic year. So I was away from Chicago, and when I came back to Chicago, many things changed. I changed how the magazine looked. My husband and I split. I mean, all kinds of things, the kinds of sort of like a pre-midlife crisis, I guess, for me. But I also, at that point, had met a number of East Coast architects, because people on the East Coast were building in the Midwest. And also people on the East Coast were starting to read Inland Architect, because it wasn't purely reporting like the trade magazines. There was a lot of debate and discussion. I would encourage, someone might write about postmodernism, because postmodernism was a big thing in the 80s, in Chicago especially, this capital of modernism, right? So there would be debate between issues. In one issue, somebody would say, oh, this is postmodernism. And in another issue, someone would say, postmodernism is bad. So there was always this discussion about things other than just building, but about ideas and criticism as well. And so people outside of the Midwest were starting to read the magazine, because there was no other professional or trade magazine doing that kind of writing, carrying that kind of conversation among architects, historians, some theorists in their pages. So after the Loeb Fellowship, one of the architects I had met was Peter Eisenman, who was building the Wexner Center in Ohio. And we had done a cover story about that. And he approached me and said, I've been talking with Arata Izozaki in Tokyo and Ignazi de Sola Morales in Barcelona, and the three of us want to start a think tank in New York, and we wonder if you would be interested in joining us, because we think you could run it. And we want to do publications and blah, blah, blah. So I flew with Peter to Tokyo to meet Izozaki, and Izozaki thought, yeah, she's good, let's do this. And Izozaki raised $1 million to launch the project with Shimizu Corporation, which was the second largest design build company in the world. They pledged $1 million because we said we would do a 10-year project. So they were going to give us $100,000 a year to run this think tank and do conferences through the 90s, the 10 years leading up to the millennium, on the condition of architecture at the end of the millennium, at the end of the 20th century. So that involved curating, but I don't like the word curating, because I'm not I don't think of myself as a curator. I think of myself as an editor, and I think the actions are very different. But that involved organizing an annual conference at a different city each year under the umbrella of the words, any compound words in the English language dictionary. So anyone, anywhere, anytime, anyhow. So there are 10 of those words. So we assigned one to each year. And the first conference was in Los Angeles at the Getty Center. The second one was in southern Japan in a small town. The third was in Barcelona. So Peter Isozaki and Ignacy de Sola Morales were sort of heading up those. And then we were in Montreal. We were in Seoul, Korea. We went to Buenos Aires. We went to Rotterdam, to Ankara, Istanbul and Ankara, to Paris. I'm missing one, I think. The last one was at the Guggenheim in New York City in the year 2000. And it was a kind of, I don't know, movable feast, I guess. There was always a core group of architects and thinkers who attended every year. And then the local hosts, like in Seoul, Korea, we were with a group called Thursday Architects. They were called Thursday Architects because they had lunch together on Thursdays. And they organized our being able to come to Seoul and where the conference would be and who would be there. So I would be in charge with the board of the Anyone Corporation for a certain number of speakers, participants, and they would be in charge for the other half. So we would have about 25 people. And so it always included Isozaki, Sola Morales, and Eisenman, but also Rem Koolhaas, the theorist Frederick Jameson, the theorist Mark Taylor. And then Isozaki had a certain Japanese contingent, a young economist and a young comparative literature theorist. Ito came, Ando came, Sejima came. Over the course of time, Greg Lynn, Alejandro Zayaropolo, Ben Van Berkel, Elizabeth Diller, Elizabeth Gross, Beatriz Calomina. I mean, there was just a lot of different participation, and it would change when you would change the cities. So when we were in Turkey, we had a lot of people from Turkey who participated, also from India. When we were in Seoul, we also had people from not only Japan, but from Singapore. And when we were in Argentina, obviously we had people from Mexico and Brazil that I remember. So it was always engaging people in the region in which that city was located. And we turned the proceedings of every conference into a book. So there are 10 books that document those 10 conferences, each with the name, anyone, anywhere. So that was the beginning of the Anyone project and how that came together. I was the only founder that wasn't an architect. Iso, Peter, and Ignacy were architects, and I was an architecture editor and journalist. So yes, but also I did all the dirty work. I made sure we all had airplane tickets to get to these places, or that the books came out. I spent a lot of time editing, and I would transcribe the conversations and edit the conversations. And everyone who presented a paper had to then mail me their paper or fax me their paper, right? This is before internet. So communication was a little bit slower. It was telephone, postage in the mail, or fax machine. So it was like another era, and a different way of working. When we did the Japan conference, it was great because I would come into the office in the morning and I would have faxes from Japan. And I could take all day to figure out how to answer them and fax them when I went home, because then it's morning in Japan. So that was a particularly good relationship in terms of time zones. When we were in Argentina, I made a special trip to Buenos Aires to help them fundraise for the local costs. Did that also in Rotterdam. Went to Rotterdam to work on how the conference was going to work out. So there was always this kind of movement and how to make things work together, and also always kind of looking ahead. What is the next year? So when we were in Montreal, for example, the Koreans who wanted the conference to come there next, they also came to Montreal so they could see what happened and who was there, make decisions about who they might want to have also come to Seoul, and so forth. So it was always a movable feast. And at the first event in the first 2 years, actually, the French philosopher Jacques Derrida was there. The Brazilian, oh my gosh, I've just forgotten his name. He was a professor of law at Harvard, and he eventually went back. Roberto Ungers from Brazil, who was at Harvard at the time, and ultimately went back to Sao Paulo when he became finance minister for a government, I think around the millennium. Forget exactly when that was. I've lost touch with him now. But there were many people not involved in architecture. The idea of the Anyone Project, and it continues to be the idea, is that architecture is the host, that the discussion begins with architecture, whether we're talking about form or space or politics or economies or theory or philosophy or history, that architecture is where we start to think about it. Or these other disciplines were invited in to talk about architecture and tell us how they viewed architecture so we could learn from each other. So that's what's documented in those books. So 2 years into the project, in 1993, we realized that doing one event a year in these remote places from our base was not enough activity to really move the discourse. And how were we going to determine how to invite younger people? Because the founders were all of a certain age. And so who are going to be the next people that come along? I mean, Isozaki's always had a good sense in Japan, with Ito, with Seijima, that they should, those were younger people who should come along. When we were in Paris, I did the conference with the historian Jean-Louis Cohen, and he knew very well who the young French architects were that he wanted in the conference. But we thought that we would launch a new magazine, and it was called Any. It's a tabloid-sized magazine, like a newspaper. Any, we decided, was an acronym for Architecture New York. So the subtitle was Architecture New York, and each issue was thematic and had a guest editor. So in a certain way, I was repeating what I did in Chicago by finding experts on the theme and having them do the content. I did not write much in any magazine. I wrote a Dear Reader letter at the front of every issue, but I didn't write about the themes themselves. So I did, for example, the first issue was on writing in architecture. But I think the fourth one, or third or fourth one, I did with the philosopher and theologian Mark Taylor, who I was working with in the conferences, on the subject of electrotecture. So electrotecture is a word Mark coined to talk about the new spaces online, which in the early 90s were called chat rooms. So you and I could meet online if we had a computer that was hooked up in some way through typing. We couldn't see each other. We couldn't speak to each other, but I could type a message to you in real time and you could type right back. So we'd be having a live conversation, probably like text messaging today, right? But we were doing it in the space, whatever that space was, of the internet, which was then called the World Wide Web. So he brought together a fascinating group of people to talk about how this space, these rooms, because they were called rooms on the web, could change how we think about architecture or inhabit architecture itself, how we inhabit this kind of room. Will we need this kind of room if we have the rooms on the World Wide Web? So there was that kind of theorizing about the place of architecture with the beginning of the web. I mean, the web has metastasized so quickly that it's hard to believe we were talking about this 25 years ago, but we were. We did special issues on the virtual. We did a design competition with the magazine on the virtual house. Every issue was meant to be on a theme, but also have an event, so it would activate discussion. It wouldn't reflect what you or I were doing or what they're doing over here or that. We're not reporting. We're generating completely new content through conversation with an audience and then putting it in the magazine. And this was a way to involve a lot of younger people as well, who would then become participants in the conference. So then in 1994, 95, we started a book series that I still do with MIT Press called Writing Architecture. And because we realized we were working with a lot of people who should be writing books in English in the United States. And so our first projects were to translate Kojun Karatani from the Japanese and Bernard Kesh in Paris from the French, and to introduce their thinking to an English reading audience. So it was an event plus publication project. And we did that for 10 years. And the last Any magazine came out in October 2000. And the last Any conference book, called Anything, came out 1 year after the conference in the summer of 2001. So in August of 2001, Isozaki was in New York, and we had dinner together, and I said, Iso, we have finished the project. The conferences are done. The books are done. The magazine is done because there's no money that can finish the magazine, but I do have $10,000 left in the bank account. What should I do with it? And Isozaki said, leave it there. You will think of something, which is an amazing thing to say. So I left it there. And 1 month later, the World Trade Center was attacked. And all hell broke loose everywhere. New York was very scary. And I didn't really have a job because there was no money to pay me a salary. The program was over. So I was helping Peter Eisenman. Meanwhile, he and I got married. I helped him finish a couple of books. And then the only architectural project I ever worked on or participated on was a design for the World Trade Center site. Because New York and its Build Back Better, shall we say, immediately wanted to rebuild the World Trade Center site. So that it didn't seem that New York had been defeated in any way. And it wasn't defeated. They they had a design competition, and Peter teamed up with Stephen Hall, Charles Gwathmey, and Richard Meyer as a team and put in a proposal. And they were one of the teams, I think there were 7 teams, there might have been 9, I forget the exact number, that were asked to do the competition. And after the design principals met together, the first thing they decided they needed was me on the team so that there would be a book documenting what they did. So I moved into Richard Meyer's office for the duration of the competition. He had the largest office, so he had the most room. And we had 60 people from the 4 offices, Hall, Gwathmey, Eiserman, and Meyer, working on this project for the duration of the competition. I forget how many weeks it was. And I did a book on the project. It was an extraordinary experience. I was in on every design meeting, every design review, every critique. Someone just sent me photographs that they found of me in the room and these reviews. And I'm looking at them and I'm thinking, I'm the only woman in the room. I can't believe this. Look at, there's like 10 people in the room and me. I don't remember it that way, right? Because there were a lot of women on the team, but I guess they weren't in the design review when they would review look at the models and the drawings and take it back out to the designers. We presented the project along with everyone else in December of 2002. Was it December? Yeah. And I knew right away, because of the discussion in the media, that I needed to start a new magazine. So I thought, I'm sitting on this network that I developed for 10 years of some amazing 400 people in architecture and philosophy and film and art and, sociology, economics. I need to use that network. I need to reactivate it. So I printed postcards and I mailed them out into the world. And I said, I'm doing a new magazine. It's going to be a literary format. We're going to resist the seductive power of the image, because I felt image was dominating everything. In the World Trade Center competition, it was the image on the skyline that everyone was responding to, not so much what's happening on the ground or all these other aspects. And having been so intimately involved in trying to find a solution for that site, I felt there were so many issues that weren't being discussed, either in the city or by the press. I thought we needed a magazine that would discuss all those kinds of issues and not rely on beautiful photorealistic renderings. So that magazine is called Log, for a ship's log, meant to observe the movement of architecture, because I felt at that time architecture was also moving in different directions. And I didn't know if architecture was going to gel and move in one direction, a la modernism or deconstruction or whatever, right? As in previous historical moments, or if it was going to continue to be sort of fragmented and moving in various ways. And I thought we needed a magazine that was watching, which is a kind of journalistic approach, right? And keeping track of what's happening. And so I wrote to all these people, and we printed the first issue and had a launch party in September 2003. And we just published issue number 52. So we've been doing it for, what's this, 2021? How many years is that? 18 years, which was never on my mind when we started it. But we've done some interesting things, occasional thematic issues with guest editors, and hundreds of different writers from all over the world, translating things from Spanish, from Chinese, from French, from German, from so that it's international. It's not about New York per se, but rather architecture on a global scale. I mean, I've had people like Wang Shu writing for us, which was very exciting for me. It's how he looks at Chinese landscape painting and what Chinese poetry means to him and how that affects how he thinks about architecture and the way he makes architecture. Interviews with different people. Ilya Zengelis, who was one of the founding partners of the Office for Metropolitan Architecture, or OMA. A long interview with Elizabeth Diller when they did the mile-long opera here in New York in 2018. I mean, just many different things, and introducing many new voices in architecture. A lot of young practitioners, academics, writers, and always doing it fact-checking, and as things become more and more slippery in the media universe of get it out there fast and nobody's sort of checking, is that right? We check, right? We do fact check. We track down footnotes to make sure they're right. We get permissions for photographs. I mean, we have a very professional operation, which may be one reason why it's still going. We're now working on number 53. But it's become a kind of place to test ideas, not just observe what's happening, but also test ideas. I think of it as a platform for testing ideas, where an architect can test a concept, test an idea, but test it through words and drawing. It's a black and white magazine, so no sexy 4-color renderings in blog. I have always dreamed that we would reach people outside the discipline. But it turns out it's very hard to do unless they're in academia. There's a certain, let's call it intellectual curiosity. And I don't mean that these people are intellectuals, but that they have a certain curiosity or kind of insatiable quest for knowledge, that they're interested in what happens in architecture and how architects think and how architects shape space and how those spaces then shape public behavior, right? So there is a certain kind of person who's not an architect, who's interested in what we do, but not very many. Not the banker down the street. I mean, they're looking at Architectural Digest because they want a special house. They're not thinking about what that means. What is architecture? What does architecture do besides shelter? So I thought by making a literary format, by having a small magazine that's mostly text, it's modeled on a magazine called McSweeney's, which had done, I think was founded in the year 2000 maybe, and I had been a subscriber, and I really admired it. So Log is exactly the same size as the original McSweeney's, a different typography and a different layout inside. But the idea was that it would look like a literary magazine. It would look like something you wanted to sit and read. It's not a picture book. And when I've worked with guest editors, they've always pushed in bigger pictures. And our original pictures were like postage stamps. They were small. And I worked with Michael Meredith on an issue that he called The Absurd. And he wanted nothing but full bleed photographs. So across the gutter every time. And it's only black and white, so it's not as seductive as color. But I realized, actually, we could do that. It's not Architectural Digest. It's not National Geographic, whatever. It's still just black and white. So we do bigger images. If things aren't just postage stamps anymore, unless we don't have any room because the text is so long. But that still didn't get us very many readers outside of architecture. In architecture, only architects talk about architecture. Yes. I mean, I can be at a party in pre-COVID and someone would say to me, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm an architecture editor and writer. Oh, my favorite architect is Howard Rourke. Now, Howard Rourke is a fictitious character in The Fountainhead. He's not a real person, right? So maybe they read that book in high school or college. Or they know who Ayn Rand is, but they don't know what architecture is. If their favorite architect is a fictitious character, they have no clue. And that's been said to me more than once, more than twice, at different parties by different people. I'm like, oh my God. Architecture has a public relations problem. But I think a lot of people think architecture is out of their price range, shall we say. And they don't know how to commission an architect even for a small house. They don't know what that means. They think it must be very expensive. And yes, if you want to buy a house, but you want to make a new one, it's going to cost more than to just buy the one down the street that's already there. So most people do that. I've only ever done that, right? But it's not consumable, shall we say, the way music is or art. Like we're supposed to go to the museum, we pay a little ticket and we get to see all this art and feel like, oh, we've just seen art. But that doesn't mean everybody there can talk about it or write about it. And I think the vast majority don't. It's just that people like you and I are aware of these things and we're interested in these things. So we might talk about them and we might write about them, but the vast majority don't. They go because they were told, oh, there's this, by some neighbor, oh, you should go see this Jasper Johns show. Like someone told me just yesterday, there's a Jasper Johns show that just opened at the Whitney Museum here in Manhattan. And they said, you've got to go see it. But yeah, I'll probably go see it. But you have to sort of hear about it or see a press release about it. You can't keep up with every review written by every art critic or every music critic. You're either a fan of the opera or you're not a fan of the opera. So you might read the opera critic or you wouldn't. You might read the rock and roll critic or you might read the jazz critic. But not that many people can write about any of that stuff. They might tweet about it, but they cannot write about it, right? I was born and raised in the western part of the state of Massachusetts in New England. I grew up in a village of 2,000 people. And my dream as a child was to have a country house and a city house. My parents used to bring my brothers and me to New York City every January to see the New York City boat show because my father was a big boater. And the boat show would be like in the convention center with, all these boats. And he would want to come and see the boats every year. So starting at about, age 10, I guess, he started bringing my brothers and me. I was the oldest of 3 kids, bringing us to New York. And so I thought New York was fascinating, right? And so I didn't understand it. And then when I was entered publishing and went to the publishing procedures course after college at Radcliffe, I realized that all the publishing centers in the United States were on the East Coast, in Boston and in New York City. So I came to New York and had some interviews, and it was in the mid-1970s, and there was a garbage strike, and it was really hot, and it was awful. And I thought, I do not want to live in this awful city. And so I went up the Hudson River to Troy, New York, and started this newspaper job instead. But New York has always been a special place to me. And so when I was asked to leave Chicago and come to New York to run the Anyone Project, it was an easy decision. Easy. And then Peter and I became involved, so that made it even easier. It's another accident. Just like I was I accidentally fell into architecture in Chicago because of what I'd been doing in Ohio, right? In art and preservation. Because I have a bit of a public presence, I would be invited to juries at schools, studio juries here and there. I've been at Columbia, at Yale, at Harvard, and at Pratt in Brooklyn, I think Ohio State. I've been in some different places. Or I would lecture here and there now and then about log or something in different schools. They would ask me to come and talk for an hour. And so I would do that, and I didn't think about it at all. And then one day, I was in the grocery store right here up the street from the office, and I was getting yogurt for breakfast. And standing next to me was a woman I've known, an architect, for a number of years, and she was buying yogurt, and she teaches at Pratt. And she turned to me and she said, "Cynthia, would you ever consider teaching? Would you teach at Pratt?" I'm just like buying yogurt. And I said, "I've never thought about teaching. I've never done any teaching other than I did a 1-week seminar in Lyon when Odile Deck started her new school of architecture called Confluence in France. But other than that 1 week, which is kind of a 5-day seminar, I didn't teach a course, right? I didn't teach for a semester. So I said, "Well, we can talk about it if you want." "Sure, what would you want me?" She wanted me to teach writing because she felt the students really needed to think about what they write, right? Not to just scribble. I said, "Well, that would be a challenge." So we had several meetings, and I talked out what I thought might be a course that involved history, theory, and writing, so that there would be models of writing starting in the early 20th century that I thought that they could learn from, and that was all short form writing, not long, but short, so that if you can think and get to the point more quickly, you don't have to write so many words. So you could argue that's also a journalistic approach, because newspaper stories can't be too long. There's no space, and the reader traditionally doesn't have a lot of time to devote to an article in the newspaper, except maybe on Sunday. So I entered the post-pro program at Pratt and started teaching. And I've now been teaching for 3 years. I teach at Pratt in Brooklyn. And then Cornell University asked me to teach a very similar writing course in their Manhattan program down at near the Battery, the southern tip of Manhattan. And this term, I'm teaching at Princeton, a writing seminar. So it's a lot of fun. I have to read a lot of student writing, which is exhausting, because I try to give them feedback as an editor. I'm not teaching them to write. I'm teaching them to become better writers and better thinkers. Or I should reverse that, to become better thinkers and better writers. And to become a better thinker, you have to become a better observer, and you have to ask better questions. So there's this whole process. Look more closely, ask better questions. What did you see? What did you learn? Now you can write it down. So there's a process. Too many people, I think, sit down to write before they know what they think. So that becomes a major problem. So they're writing a lot of gibberish before they figure out what it is they want to say. And they have to learn to get rid of the gibberish and have clear sentences. And it's hard. But it's fun. Well, I know more about the European scene than I do the Latin American or the Asian, because I know a number of Europeans who have come to the United States for graduate school, and then they think they want to stay here to practice, but they realize they would have a better route if they went back to Europe, because there's more of a design culture. There's no real there's no real public appreciation of architecture in the United States, I don't think. People take it for granted. They don't know if it could be better or if it could be worse. They don't understand the economics of it. They don't think about it. And there are a lot of very conservative views in this country and a lot of what we call pragmatists, right? One reason I stopped doing any magazine in 2000 is not because there was a lack of interest or people wanting to write for it. Everyone said to me, you have to keep any magazine going, even though the conferences are finished, because it has a value. But I couldn't raise the money for it in this country. Most of the money I raised to run that magazine came from overseas. It came from Korea. It came from Germany. Very little of it came from here, other than from individual architecture firms who liked what I was doing, but not from the general sense. There was no corporation, no foundation here in the United States that said, oh, theory is important. I mean, the one thing that was extraordinary about Shimizu Corporation underwriting the Anyone series for 10 years, which I later understood about Japanese culture, is that they think it's really important to spend time thinking. And this country, I think we react too fast. That there are moments where you're not slowing down and thinking. And I don't know what that's like in Peru or where you're from, but it's, I think it's a problem here, and people want to solve problems. That's it. We got to solve a problem, and we've got to make something to sell, right? And there's always a hurry up on that. And so you don't really think it through. I mean, it's like the whole problem of the plastic water bottle now, right? Nobody thought that through at the outset. I mean, I can't blame them, because when I started Log, I did not think it through. I didn't think, well, how many trees are we going to kill with all this paper that we use? Or how much carbon are we going to put into the atmosphere because we have to deliver this package of words on a truck or an airplane to somewhere in the world? I didn't think about that. And now we're all starting to think about these other things. But then I also say, if I'm going to send this compilation of material out via email or sell it on our website or have an internet presence, that's not without a carbon footprint either. It might be less, but how less is it? It's an unbelievable amount of plastic and copper and energy. And who's supplying the energy? So it's a conundrum. How do you work your way out of that? How do you think about that? I mean, I am an original Earth Day marcher. I was in high school in 1970 when they had the first Earth Day march. And my son will say to me, Mom, your generation screwed up everything, but my generation will fix it. Don't worry, right? And I say, well, that's good. I'm glad you're going to fix it because, yeah, things are screwed up, but I don't think my generation is totally at fault. Could be, but my generation was also right there at the beginning of Earth Day marches and zero population growth and cleaning up the water supply in this country, which is meaning the public water supply, not the lakes and the rivers. And I mean, the river in Cleveland caught fire. It was so polluted with oil and gas that it caught fire. I mean, water doesn't burn, but there was so much oil in the water. The river itself was on fire. So things were pretty bad. I think the hardest thing for me personally is to overcome the fear that someone will say no. And that this is particularly true when it comes to money. That Because if we had a lot more money for this project, we could be doing a lot more things. And I could have more than one person working with me. And I mean, sometimes I have two, sometimes I have three. Right now, in this COVID crisis, there's only one person working with me as a paid salaried worker. Money always seems to be an issue, and it's a very difficult issue for me because you have to pay the printer and you have to buy a new computer now and then, and you have to have a place to have a desk. And even though we've been working from home, we're now sort of coming back to work in the office. We're all here today, for example, but we're not here every day yet. But I think that having to overcome the fear of no has always been important to me. And I finally was able to do that in 2016, which was only 5 years ago, when Monica Ponce de Leon and I co-curated the US Pavilion for the Venice Biennale on speculative, and we commissioned speculative projects for Detroit and put them on display in Venice. And then after Venice, the show went to Detroit, and then it went to Los Angeles in 2017. So it was a huge curatorial effort, and Monica and I had to raise a lot of money to do it. It was an $800,000 project because we had to pay 12 different architecture teams to make models and drawings and of all new work. We didn't go into their offices and say, oh, we want that. We brought them all to Detroit. We assigned them neighborhoods. We had them meet people in Detroit. Then they had to make projects. And then when we moved the exhibition to Detroit, it was really a big thing. But maybe because it was a big project with a lot at stake, a lot of eyes in Venice, right? A truly international stage where you can't hide behind the covers of a magazine. You have to be right out front. I got over that fear, but it was pretty late in life to get over that fear. So I would think that's been my obstacle.
And looking to the future, what is something that you want to do?
Well, we're having an event here this evening that is a kind of the beginning of a long sequel to Log 47, which was an issue called Overcoming Carbon Form. When we did log number 8 many years ago, we had done an issue called A Critique of Sustainability, because I was very critical of LEED certification. You know what LEED certification is, right? Gold, silver, and now you can get platinum because your toilets are low flush or the lights turn off if you're not moving in the room and you're in the dark all of a sudden, that kind of thing. And I thought, this is not enough. This was, 15 years ago, we probably did that issue. And I thought, we really need to do another issue. And I got together with a young architect named Elisa Iturbi, who's originally from Mexico and lives and works here in New York. And she came up with this idea of overcoming carbon form. So how can architecture, once again, architecture as the host, architecture as the originator, how can architecture overcome its own dependence on fossil fuels to make form? How can architecture find a way around fossil fuel culture to make urban form and architectural form that isn't dependent on oil, so that we can reduce carbon footprint simply by how we live, not just how we build. We feel that a lot of architecture has been looking at materials and methods of construction, which is important. It's an important piece of the puzzle, but they haven't been looking directly at form itself and how we make urban form and architectural form. And so that's what we're trying to work on now as a kind of continuation of what we started in log 47, which was 2 years ago in the fall of 2019. We wanted to start this project last year, but COVID interrupted that. And I'm working with a developer in the state of Texas, of all places, to try to come up with the money to really go at it hard and fast in the next 5 years. So it would be a 5-year project to try to get to the heart of this and have some real suggestions that we might be able to test in the field before we reach that critical date of 2030, see if we can make a difference. So that's what we're working on. It means that log is going to continue, but we also have another project. And if we can get the money, we'll have people working on this problem while we also do log. And log will probably be publishing some of that material as well.